Welcome to Roots of Faith. I'm Renee Richard. Today we are in St. James Parish, east bank of the river, in the town of Paulina. We're going to be visiting St. Joseph Catholic Church, again part of a great history along the River Road. So join us as we explore this parish. I'm Renee Richard, and today we're here in Paulina, Louisiana at St. Joseph Church with my pastor, Father Vincent Dufresne. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, I'm glad to have you with us today.
That's it. And with a name like Dufresne, are you close to home? We're close to your roots here, right?
Very much so. Was born in New Orleans, but grew up in Vacherie, which is just across the river. And as I told people, from door to door, I'm 10 minutes from my home of birth and growing up, so very close.
Isn't that amazing? Tell us a little bit about your journey through the priesthood to the priesthood.
Sure. Thanks be to God, I've been a priest now almost 36 years. Wow. Again, growing up in Vacherie at St. Philip Church, felt the call to the priesthood, entered St. Joseph Minor Seminary, which was Cathedral Prep in Baton Rouge. Was there for 4 years and continued on with St. Mary's in Houston. And then the bishop, thinking I wasn't smart enough, sent me to Rome to get my graduate degree, and so was ordained in 1983 with my classmate, Father Cleo Milano, which is also he's local Donaldsonville. Two of us have been classmates since second grade, which is one of those neat celebration points for us. So
You're
yes.
Right. That's it. And you are one of our canon lawyers as well, are you not, for
Correct,
the diocese?
Yes. After getting my graduate degree in moral theology, Bishop Ott sent me back to Rome to get a second degree in canon law. So.
Okay, great. So, and you said that was Bishop Ott, right? So
Correct.
Quite a few years you've been a canon lawyer
yes.
for us here.
Again, added
That's
up.
Okay. That's okay. We're not worried about dates. It's just the important role that you serve
Correct. Both,
for the diocese in
both
that capacity.
Moral theology and canon law, yes.
Now here at St. Joseph, how long have you been here?
This summer I'll be finishing up my 10th year.
10th year, wow. And actually, you are pastor not just here, but
Correct.
two other parishes on either side of this, correct?
Yes. Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about what that encompasses.
We make up the Catholic Church in East St. James. It's a cluster of 3 churches, St. Michael in Convent, St. Joseph here in Paulina, and Most Sacred Heart of Jesus in Gramercy. And so as a cluster, we have one central office location here in Paulina, one place of residence at Sacred Heart in Gramercy, though I do periodically stay at the rectory in St. Michael in Convent as well. But our cluster has the masses at all 3 churches every weekend and continue to share many of the activities across parish boundaries.
That's true. And although you serve in this large capacity as the pastor of all 3, we're showcasing each one individually. So today we'll be talking about this parish. However, it's kind of intertwined with the other 2.
And that's the
we'll
point for me is I came in here when the cluster was already formed.
Correct.
And I often liken it to being a father of 3 children.
Okay.
Each one has their own characteristics, but you never want to have one that's more important than the other, so you love all 3 of them equally.
That's true. So true it is. And actually what ended up happening, I think 2 were clustered back under Bishop Alfred Hughes.
Correct.
When he was with us. And that was in the late 90s, 97, 98. Don't quote me on dates.
Yeah.
I think Father Uter was here at the time, and they actually clustered this parish, am I right, with Gramercy, and St. Michael was independent of that. And then under Bishop Munch, around 2003, they added St. Michael to the cluster, and that's when the name kind of changed. Y'all call them yourselves the Catholic Church of the East Bank of St. James, correct?
Exactly.
Because this is it. In St. James, these 3 churches are the parishes, and I believe there's one, St. Mary's Chapel, and then there's a mission in Lutcher.
Correct.
Correct?
Yes, St. Mary's in Union belonged to
Union.
St. Michael's, and when St. Joseph was established, of course, it took over Our Lady of Prompt Succor in Lutcher and also St. Philomena in Grand Point.
Right.
So yes, Father Frank Uter came in when the Maris surrendered their oversight of Most Sacred Heart and Gramercy and St. Joseph and Paulina, so that was the first time to have a single pastor, though the Marist had enough priests available to continue operating St. Michael's. When that pastor needed to retire, that's when the diocese adopted all three churches and put them together as a cluster.
Okay, very good. As far as this specific parish, because you were saying they're all different, what are some of the demographics per se, like, your community, or how many parishioners or families?
And St. Joseph is the largest by population.
Okay.
It's sort of matching St. Michael by territory, but St. Michael in the convent area, the population there has declined so much because of just the change over time, the farming community, and then now so much industry. But so St. Joseph has nearly 1,700 families.
Okay, very good.
Compared to St. Michael that has a little bit more than 400, or Gramercy, Sacred Heart has about 700. So 1,700 families, it does make it the largest by population. And I believe because Paulina is not an incorporated civil entity, it's just the community. Our people here at St. Joseph, I find them ready to go beyond what would be considered the boundaries, so that we have a lot of ministers who affiliate with St. Joseph as their parish of registration, but they're serving at Sacred Heart, or they're serving at St. Michael, which I find is a wonderful display of their Catholic, meaning universal faith. They're not confined. Now, this has also grown into the other parishes as well, but I find St. Joseph has always had an attitude, if you will, of a willingness to be involved beyond the boundaries. And they're super when it comes to asking for volunteers, when it comes to trying to accomplish activities. The parishioners here do step up. And again, I have to be a good dad, not that the others don't, but
right, it's just the characteristic of this community.
Most definitely, most definitely.
Right. As we've been talking about these three parishes, but really, viewers, let's kind of let them know how it all evolved, because, it's understanding, how we grow as a church, how one is grown out of the other. And so in our early beginnings, St. James, right across the river, we're in St. James Parish, not Lower St. James, but St. James Parish. The Acadians are some of the first settlers that came in the late 1700s under Spanish rule, and for many years, the church of this whole area evolved around St. James. But of course, the mighty Mississippi divides us, and even though it was a meandering river with low levees, and they crossed often by skiffs, over time, by about 1807, 1809, the people that had established farms and their work environment, their homes on this side of the river, then we're having to cross, and there were about 105, 110, I don't like numbers, but in that ballpark, families that signed a petition to the bishop requesting them to have a chapel or church on this side of the river. And the Cantrell brothers, St. Jacques Cantrell, who gave the land for St. James, had a brother, St. Michael. So I think that's how St. Michael the Archangel, but in honor of Michael Cantrell, and I believe he may have even donated the land where that church was established. But we'll do that more in a show on St. Michael's. I haven't researched that. But St. Michael's then becomes a chapel, a mission of St. James until about 1831. I do know that date from archives. It was established as an independent parish at that point. So we're looking at that time frame where there's big growth. We're state now. You've got people coming in from all over, from France, with what's happening in France by the 1840s, to these people coming downriver from Kentucky and all, because this is the boom of the antebellum period. So by 1848, the priest at St. Michael realizes that people are having a difficult time getting to him. You can come up the river in a boat, but when we think of roads, a muddy Mississippi River road, right, with levees that overflowed, because we didn't have these levees. So he just says, I'm going to establish two chapels for the people upriver and downriver. He establishes St. Mary's Chapel in Union, which is roughly 10 miles north of St. Michael. And then he establishes St. Joseph here in what was known then as the St. Joseph District, south of St. Michael's by roughly 10 miles. And this allowed the people to get to Mass more readily, and it was himself that had to make the journey to the two. And so as time grew, growth along the river, this area along the river grew more and more. And so at that point, this was a mission of St. Michael. They put a chapel here, 1849, but in 1900, it becomes its own parish. And there were things that brought that on, the lumber business being established right downriver, major sugar mill being established just downriver. More and more people, Italians coming into this region, turn of the century, to work in these two big industries. And so that's where this becomes the parish south. Now, at that point, we were talking about missions, like St. Mary stayed attached to St. Michael because it was north of St. Michael. St. Michael at the time had another, St. Philomena at Grand Point, and when this became a parish, this parish took over the mission of St. Philomena, correct?
Yes.
And that little parish, actually, there are several. It was built on the Martin land, and his daughter Desiree Martin, who was a former Sister of the Sacred Heart, started some early education, catechist there. I believe 1909, which was a major hurricane or storm that took the steeple at St. Elizabeth and several other steeples, actually destroyed that little chapel enough. But after that, they named it, it was first St. Vincent de Paul, they named it St. Philomena. And it remained in existence until Hurricane Betsy, right?
Exactly, yes.
I think at that point it was
in
destroyed.
1964, yes.
And I know the bell from it is at the firehouse, went to the firehouse there.
Correct, yes, exactly.
But being it was attached here, there were some other missions here. The church at Gramercy, which is now its own parish, was also a mission of this one that later became. And pretty much that's
and Our
the
Lady
early
of Prompt
story.
Succor.
In Lutcher, that's true, because actually that mission was established, well, it was a mission, but it wasn't a parish, and Gramercy became a parish, and then it became attached to Gramercy, right?
Well, and it's because each of the civic communities deserve their own Catholic identity. And so the Marist saw to it that each community that had its own identity would also have its own church. In order that they could come together and worship together. And so that even the town of Lutcher still takes pride in Our Lady of Prompt Succor Chapel that is a mission of St. Joseph. But the beautiful thing about it is that St. Joseph Church we utilize on the weekend for our Sunday worship, but the Lutcher Chapel has become our daily Mass chapel.
Oh, wow.
And the beauty of that is that for a daily Mass, the chapel seats about 200 people.
So
we usually get 120, 140 people at daily Mass, which is a beautiful testament again to the faith.
That is. And really, in today's world with good roads, that's not an inconvenience as it was in the days when they were established in these churches. We were talking, you keep mentioning the Marist, of course. Just to give you a background, St. Michael's was founded by Jesuit, but they didn't stay at that point. And so the Marist fathers came, and they ministered in this area for many, many years. Like you said earlier, until the diocesan priests took it over. Talking about St. Joseph becoming a parish in 1900, but there were catastrophic things that happened in this parish in 1920. There was a fire that occurred. It started in the rectory, and in minutes the rectory was gone, and it came immediately. The rectory sat adjacent to this church, or what the church has stood on this property, and this church went up in flames in 1920. Certain things were recovered before the entire thing was lost that are here now that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The pews. No, the pews were lost. The priest, I think,
these were done as part of the rebuilding.
Right, but the Stations of the Cross.
Stations of the Cross
are
preserved.
A few of the statues, but I could not find a references to exactly which ones. Are y'all aware of which ones?
Honestly, I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Sure.
But they did a few of the statues that you may see in here, and I can't even say how many, were a few things that people rushed in and took with them before the church was lost. The pastor at the time that the fire occurred, was so distraught over it all that he left and did not return. His associate at the time was a young priest by the name of Father Constantin Chauve. Father Constantin took the bull by the horns. He became the pastor here and immediately began the recovery for this church, for this parish. It was Father Chauve who actually, the pews you see in here are made out of cypress, and there were 84 of them, and he personally carved the heads of them with a crucifix individually in his recovery of it. So while we're talking about this church and what happened with with it being rebuilt, let's talk a little bit, because you did some major renovations. I think just minor things had been done previously.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here today.
And the interesting thing is that when I arrived, again, maintenance had been taken care of, but the maintenance was getting ahead of just the ability to keep the church. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we discovered in the age of automation and air conditioning, the church was not built for air conditioning. Oh, wow. And so when the windows were closed, in order to allow for the air conditioning, what the air conditioning did was it dried out the plaster.
Oh, no.
All of these walls, inside and out, were plaster. When the plaster dried out, it allowed moisture to seep in, and the actual wood framing in between the exterior plaster, interior plaster started to rot.
Wow, you don't think about those things.
And so what we had to do was come in, we had to remove as much of the dead plaster as we could, mm-hmm. to do some shoring up of the wood framing in the walls of the church, to allow a replastering in section or a retreatment of the old plaster. I'd learned something new about that there's actually a chemical that you can spray on old plaster to make it alive again.
Oh, wow.
And the difference between dead plaster is that it's dry and brittle, and live plaster still has a solidness to it.
Okay.
So by recreating the life in the plaster, it actually changed the acoustics of the church.
For the good or the bad, out of curiosity?
For the more difficult.
A little more difficult, okay.
But in the process, the community came together, and they started to speak about what they wanted to see happen in this renovation. So what I took on as merely an effort to save the building,
to stabilize the building.
the community came in and said, no, let us do what the building, what our church deserves.
Oh, good.
That led to the restoration of the pews. The pews over the years had been stained and mm-hmm. restained and painted in order to sort of protect them and preserve them. But the desire to have them restored was to go back to the natural cypress appearance.
Sure.
But out of deference to Father Chauve, who had carved the crosses on them, we left the crosses in the color of the stain that had been applied. So that's why the crosses
now
on the
darker.
sides of the mm-hmm. pew stand out so much. That would have been the color of the whole pew at that point, but now we've gone back to the natural cypress. And a beautiful tidbit that I'm hoping you build to show the viewers is that the cross you see on the side of the pews was actually done in plaster and stands over Father Chauve's tomb in the cemetery. Father Chauve has a very unique central location in our cemetery that is just a gorgeous presentation of his French colonial cross that I think needs to be displayed. Wonderful. So the pews were redone. One of the changes that had happened, a minor change at the time of the Second Vatican Council, mm-hmm. was moving the altar forward, which was accomplished, but the tabernacle was moved from the center to the side. Okay. The parishioners all wanted it to be replaced into the reredo, so that's what was done. But it allowed us to take the old cupola that had been on the reredo that was placed to the side, and it was now restored. So the main mass altar and the reredo, the altar behind, are now redone in its original design. So we brought some of the history back. And the community fell in love with the redesign. And one of the things that I did that most people seem to appreciate is taking what was just the narthex of the church and turning it into a cry room space by doing the coffered glass doors so that people can come in and see the body of the church without having to enter. One of the beautiful things about St. Joseph people, they're so friendly. As soon as they come in church, they start talking. And so to have a full panel of glass doors was to allow people to gather as they normally do, to socialize, but to keep the church a place of quiet and prayer at the same time.
And I noticed a baptismal font when I came into the church. Is that new? Is that something different, or was that there?
That has been there. I honestly, I cannot speak as to which priest did it, but that was the pulpit. It was the pulpit of the old church.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That I believe it was Father Frank Uter himself that took a sugar kettle and turned the sugar kettle into a baptismal font using the old church's pulpit as the base for the baptismal font.
Yeah, I saw it when I came in, so I was curious if that was one of the things you had done, or if it was here before. So I hadn't found any research on that.
And now this gives me a chance to highlight one of our community pride and joy. We have a relic of the true cross.
Oh, goodness.
That we bring out on Good Friday for veneration, but that I do have now positioned next to the baptismal font on the wall, so that anytime any person comes to visit the church, they have a chance to pay honor to the relic of the true cross.
Wow, amazing. We've been talking about the church itself, but on these grounds, we mentioned that the parish hall here is actually the
pastoral
center for all three. So
exactly.
Your secretaries are there, every day in that building. But on these grounds, there's also a school, St. Peter.
It is St. Peter Chanel. Of course, it started as St. Joseph, but when the cluster was established, it became St. Peter Chanel, which is again a homage to the Marist fathers, because St. Peter Chanel is a Marist. And the school children have developed a great devotion for the Marist, but it's also part of our community. As I mentioned, our Marist laity, the Marist fathers brought a great devotion to the Blessed Mother, and the Marist laity have been in existence for more than 30 years, started under the Marist, continuing to have their prayer meetings weekly, and to do service around the community and such. One of the things they are very enamored with is the daily rosaries and the rosaries before our Sunday Masses.
Awesome.
So they continue to be a presence. We're ever grateful for the intercession of our Blessed Mother and what the Marists have provided for us as an added focus to our Catholic faith through our devotion to Mary. So the Marist laity are a phenomenal important part of our community.
Interesting, yes, because you don't hear about that everywhere. But like you said, the Marist fathers, that is their devotion is to Mary. And we were talking about the school, not to jump back, but one interesting thing is when this church did burn, Father Shaw immediately set up a structure to serve as the temporary church, and that became the first St. Joseph church. And it was actually through the education in this area that the town of Paulina got its name. One of the first nuns to come here in the mid 1800s to minister and to educate was Sister Mary Paulina, and there was such a devotion to her in this community that they actually went from being called the St. Joseph District to adopting the name of Paulina in 1888. Father Chauve, though, when he decided to make that, once this church was built, and he decided to convert the temporary building into the school around 1935, he brought in the Dominican sisters to teach. And so their presence was here in this parish as teachers as well. And I believe it wasn't until, again, quote, the 1950s they actually built a better structure for the children, here. And this is an interparochial school,
It is
correct?
interparochial. It covers all of East St. James, but also we have people coming from the West Bank.
The West Bank as well, correct?
Exactly.
Now, it goes pre-K through 12th?
We actually have started with a 2-year-old daycare, so we have a pre-K 3 to 8th grade.
To 8th grade,
Eighth
okay,
grade.
so, and then from here,
From here, if they're continuing
option.
Catholic education, Ascension Catholic in
Okay.
Donisonville, but also some go into the Archdiocese to St. Charles.
oh, that's true, because we're sitting on the border to the Archdiocese
Exactly.
at Lower St. James. So yes, that is not uncommon along the rivers. We saw when we did the show on Donisonville. You know, they come from all over to go to some of these interparochial schools.
Correct, yes.
This parish, we mentioned earlier that it does have a cemetery. The cemetery here was begun in the 1800s. We know that. We at the diocese do not have any burial records prior to 1920 because of that fire that we talked about earlier. The fire destroyed all of the records, whether they were here in the church or in the rectory, we don't know, and that was one of the great distresses of the pastor at that time. And Father Shaw is the one that stepped up to the plate and went door to door reconstructing the parish records. And of course, baptism being your record of your life in the church, he took forefront on. He did not reconstruct any marriages, short of marriage notations on baptisms, or any of the burials here. So we don't have a clue as to that. That would be something you would have to come out here and research. However, the baptism records that we have, he reconstructed. The biggest thing that is missing is that the Italian population here, because they were so mobile, they didn't necessarily stay in this region. They rode the rails and migrated to all parts of the United States. If they were gone from the turn of the century to 1920, when you're going door to door, you miss those people. So it's basically who could recover what. But we have 4 volumes of baptisms that Father Shaw did manage to go and follow through with getting either affidavits or word of mouth to replace those valuable records that were lost in that fire. So pretty much I think we've covered most of here. Is there anything in particular about the people here in closing that you want to just mention? I think you covered yours in the beginning with saying that they were the ones that went out to everybody. So,
Sure. Again, the generosity, the faith-filled sense of community is what makes it a joy to be the pastor here.
Good. Quick question do you know about how big the whole area is? Is it several acres, 100? Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot, but it's not. I'm just trying to give the viewers an idea of, we have the school to the right.
Okay, as far as the physical property goes, yes. We have the school on the right-hand side of the church, the area to the left. As far as acreage, probably 20, 30 acres.
Okay, and then the
it
cemetery is
includes the
directly
cemetery.
behind us here. Okay, very good. Well, Father, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you so
and
much.
folks, join us again for another episode of Roots of Faith.